Welcome back to This Week in Immigration. I'm your host, Hanadi Jordan, Communications Associate at the Bipartisan Policy Center. This week, we're hoping you'll join us for a discussion on high-skilled immigration and its role in supporting U.S. competitiveness. We'll be playing audio from our recent event, National Security and Competitiveness, Can Skilled Immigration Help? This event featured Kai Hirabayashi, Senior Manager of Public Policy at Amazon, Divyansh Kaushik, Associate Director at the Federation of American Scientists, Margaret Stock, Attorney at Cascadia Cross-Border Law Group, and BPC's Dane Stangler, Director of Strategic Initiatives. This event also featured BPC experts and previous This Week in Immigration guests Teresa Cardinal-Brown and Ben Giddis, Associate Director for BPC's Economic Policy Program. Stay tuned. For those of you who were unable to join us for our event, or even for those who loved it so much that you're back for more, we're going to break down some key moments from the April 26th event. To give a bit of context, BPC, in collaboration with Morning Consult, conducted a poll that found American voters across political parties recognize increased access to highly skilled legal immigration as a key element to growing the economy and bolstering U.S. competitiveness. But the political debate over immigration continues, and competing views highlight the challenge in reforming the immigration system. The discussion you're about to hear is moderated by podcast regular Teresa Cardinal-Brown, and the panel includes Kai Hirabayashi, Divyansh Kaushik, Margaret Stock, and Dane Stangler. The insights you're about to hear from our guests highlight how difficult the immigration system is to navigate. Let's get started.
Divyansh, let me start with you. We heard Ben noting that voters do link immigration with the economy and competitiveness, but many of us may not think of immigrants traditionally supporting national security per se, particularly with some of the requirements for clearances and things that usually go along with national security work. But tell us about where you come from and thinking that immigrants are important to our national security investments.
Thanks, Teresa. First of all, pleasure to be here. I think it's a very important question that you asked. Let's jot down memory lane for a relevant anecdote. Sir Ian Jacob, who was a military assistant secretary to Winston Churchill, remarked that the Allies won the World War because our German scientists were better than their German scientists. It has been the case with the World War. It was the case with the Cold War. And whether we call strategic competition or Cold War, whatever your preferred terminology be in today's competition with the Chinese Communist Party, it is going to play another critical role. We sent back a Caltech professor who went on and built the Chinese spaceship program. Secretary of the Navy, Dan Kimball, said, it was the stupidest mistake this country ever did. And they are not being indifferent to this issue back in China. They want all the people to come there. In fact, last year when Xi Jinping gave an address to the 20th Party Congress, he made it very clear that the CCP has no intention of slowing down in cultivating its domestic talent and recruiting from around the world. It is actually very much recruiting from Africa, where the United States is not right now. Now, they're a country 4 times our size. They're already graduating twice as many STEM PhD candidates and STEM master's degree holders. In his speech, he talked about regarding science and technology as their primary productive force, talent as their primary resource, and innovation as the primary driver of growth. He laid out explicit plans to increase investment in education, research, development in order to produce the first-class innovators and attract the brightest minds from all over. Now, it is evident that cultivated talent is going to be a major focus for the CCP. And with that, it also wants to explicitly challenge the United States in the global war for talent. And it is for a very good reason. A wealth of talent is vital to the success of any cause. But whereas here, when we are trying to onshore critical national security relevant industries, whether it's semiconductors or building our quantum computing supply chains, being ahead in cybersecurity and AI and microelectronics, puts us at a disadvantage when we have workforce shortages that are impacting the defense industry. And so in 2021, a plurality of the members of the National Defense Industrial Association said that hiring qualified skilled talent is the biggest supply chain bottleneck that they're facing. Now, imagine if that was, just if that is not getting people to think about this, then what will, right? Like if we are going to be indifferent to that situation, then we're just giving away our leadership in this important arena to the Chinese Communist Party, which we are actively trying to make sure we don't. So it goes very, like people want to say that, yes, we have to stay ahead of the race, we have to stay ahead of the curve, while at the same time, there's this massive issue that is keeping us from getting there. So the Australian Strategic Policy Institute released a report for critical technology areas and found that out of 44 critical technology areas, China currently leads in 37 of them. So imagine what happens if we do not have the skilled immigrants here. It sets us back generations. And that's not me saying, that is, I'm quoting President Trump's science advisor in his testimony to the House Science Committee recently.
Well, thank you, Divyansh. It makes me think of this idea of fighting a battle with one hand tied behind your back if you're not using all of the capabilities you have as a country to pull talent. Kai, let me turn to you. Amazon is well known as a technology company, as well as for many of us, our daily delivery service. But that means that Amazon has a very broad workforce and a broad need for talent. So tell us about Amazon's workforce and why skilled workers are so important to its various business lines.
Yeah, thank you, Teresa and Ben and Dane. We really appreciate the opportunity to talk about this important issue and appreciate BPC's work on this as well. As Teresa mentioned, my name is Kai Hirabashi. I sit in Washington, D.C., and I work on our high-skilled immigration issues, as well as just our broader immigration portfolio, too. As you all probably know, within STEM industries or within technology companies, foreign-born workers make up, last count, 23% of our entire workforce. And that's important to note because Amazon's very reflective of that. We have tens of thousands of foreign-born workers in our corporate structure, many of whom are in the immigration process somewhere. Some have already passed through it or are kind of on the end of it, and others are just in the thick of it. And so Amazon's been very public about our position for a long time about how we can fix the immigration system, in particular, looking at the high-skilled immigration part of our antiquated system. It's really important for us, as every day I look at what we can do to change the policy here. We do this on behalf of our employees. We want our employees who currently work for us to have the best customer experience, well, we call it employee experience available, right? And when they're stuck in the backlog, when they're dealing with the very complicated process of immigration, that often impacts their personal as well as their professional lives. We've seen that time and time again, where employees will come to us with problems that they face throughout the process, and they know that this might limit their opportunity for growth in the company or growth outside of our company, frankly, finding another job, moving to another city. And we just think that's been so unfair and something that, like I said, we hear from employees every day. And just to give you a little snapshot, Amazon is headquartered in Seattle, but we have corporate locations around the country, including New York, Washington, D.C. area, Nashville, California, Texas, almost in every corner of the U.S. And within that foreign-born population, as I mentioned, we typically have a lot of different visa categories, including H-1Bs, L1s, TNs, Es, F1s, J1s. We kind of go through the whole litany of alphabet soup of visas, and we're proud to have that. And part of what we continue to do as an employer is we will look for different opportunities to make sure that we have the best talent here. And if it needs that we need to recruit internationally, we always seek the best talent. And we often bring them in on these temporary visas. And then we also help provide that pathway to helping them become LPRs, and we'll help them with the green card process. And that's where we see some of our greatest demand as a company and where we see the greatest need on behalf of our employees to fix that. As I mentioned, we hear these painstaking stories every day about employees stuck in the backlog. And that's something in the green card backlog. And that's been one of our primary focuses as a company is how do we reduce that backlog, in fact, eliminate it? And then how do we help our employees navigate it? And frankly, and I think we'll get into this later, really the problem is legislatively, but also there's things that, regulatory wise we could be doing. And so Amazon is excited to, be part of this conversation and talk more about how we can fix the problem.
Thank you, Kai. Dane, let me turn to you. Kai spoke from the position of a particular company and its workforce, but we also think about competitiveness between companies and, of course, for the U.S. economy as a whole. You've dealt with this issue from a number of different angles, both from business competitiveness, from entrepreneurship. How do you look at this issue of skilled talent, and why is it so important? How does it link directly to our ability to compete?
Most of my work, Teresa, as you mentioned, has been on the entrepreneurship angle when it comes to immigrants and the contributions that immigrants have made for, more than 2 centuries to the entrepreneurial dynamism of the U.S. I think most people are familiar with very high-profile stories of successful immigrant entrepreneurs. There's lots of headline stats that float around out there. But when we really dig into the numbers, it's really astounding just how large a contribution immigrants have made to entrepreneurship and thus to economic growth and innovation in the US. We've known for a very long time that immigrants have a very high rate of business creation, of entrepreneurial activity, much higher than native-born Americans. We know that that is especially true, as you mentioned in your question, Teresa, in science and technology-based companies. One estimate from a couple of years ago was that I think 1/4 of science and technology-based startups founded in the previous decade were founded by immigrants, which is much higher than their share of the population. What's most interesting, Teresa, especially for this topic of competitiveness and national security, is that the businesses that immigrants are starting, whether science and technology-based or non-science and technology-based, tend to have a much higher employment impact than other businesses created in the US. They're not, it's not a barbell. As some people kind of sometimes push back on these statistics and say, well, yes, you have the science and technology immigrant entrepreneurs, but then you have a huge population of immigrants who are founding, businesses that are very small. Those businesses, of course, exist. Those businesses exist across all demographic categories. But consistently, what we see is across all types of businesses, all sizes of businesses, immigrants not only have a higher rate of business creation, but they have a higher employment impact. Another way to say that is they're creating more jobs for Americans than a lot of other businesses. And Teresa, at rock bottom, and what we're all talking about here is one of the most fundamental ways for us to be competitive as a national economy, for our regions to be competitive, and thus to enhance our national security, is to have a strong economy, to have a dynamic economy, lots of businesses starting, lots of businesses growing, of course, lots of businesses shrinking. That's the other part of dynamism. And one of the major inputs into that is the contribution of immigrants, both in starting those businesses, growing those businesses, and then working for those businesses. So that's an enormous angle from an economic point of view. And that also enhances, as Divyansh and Kai have both referenced, that also is this virtuous cycle of attraction for the US. If more people see opportunity to start a business here, more people will want to come here. That enhances our, what used to be called soft power, right, in the world of international relations. So it enhances that aspect as well.
Thank you very much, Dane. Margaret, I'm going to turn to you now. In your career, you focused heavily on the needs of our military for particular skills and talents, but you've also recently written about the challenges our armed forces are having in recruitment. Talk to us about how immigrants support military readiness and strategic goals.
So immigrants are definitely vital to our military readiness, and they always have been. Since the Continental Army, we've had large numbers of immigrants serving in our United States military up until recently, when the numbers dropped dramatically. So just to give you a couple of examples, during World War I, about 20% of the Army was made up of immigrants, mainly folks who had just come over from Europe, escaping the Kaiser, and they turned around and got drafted, given their citizenship, and sent back to fight on the Western Front. Same thing happened in World War II. We took in large numbers of German Jewish refugees right before the war. We turned around and drafted them, sent them back as US citizens to the Western Front. where a group of them were responsible for 60% of the actionable intelligence on the Western Front during World War II. This trend is continued throughout American history, but recently, because of our problems with our legal immigration system and policies at the Pentagon, the participation of immigrants in the military has dropped to historically low levels. So right now, immigrants are about 14% of the US population. They're less than 4% of the military. This is not because they don't want to serve. They're always beating down the doors of the recruiters. But the entry ticket to get into the military today is a green card, and it's very, very difficult to get a green card. At the outset, we showed a video where we talked about the fact that if you apply for a green card and you're not from India or China or some other countries that have long waiting periods, you might only have to wait 1.5 years to get your green card, but that's only if you qualify for one. And most people do not qualify for a green card. There is no law on the books today that gives somebody a green card for joining the United States military. There was a bill introduced by Republicans a few years ago that would give people green cards if they qualified for military enlistment and they were willing to enlist, but the bill died in Congress and never became law. Today, our armed forces are facing a historic recruiting crisis. The Army cannot meet its recruiting goals no matter how hard it tries. It's short thousands upon thousands of troops. Now, why is this? Well, we've got some major demographic changes going on in the country, and we also have a situation where the military no longer reflects society. We're not recruiting from that 14% of society that's made up of immigrants. We're restricting those folks and not letting them join the military, and that's led to a weaker military and one that is short troops. And there's no way to fix it, frankly. The only thing the military's come up with for Congress to fix the problem is just throw more money at it, give bigger bonuses. But handing out $50,000 enlistment bonuses to people who don't exist doesn't fix the problem. So what really needs to happen is immigration reform that allows people to get green cards so they can join our nation's military and make our military stronger. And I'd love to give you examples of typical people that are serving in the military today. You mentioned earlier the military accessions vital to the National Interest Program that ran successfully, started under the Bush administration. Unfortunately, was ended under the Obama administration and is defunct today. But at the time of its operation, it brought in 10,000 highly qualified, highly skilled immigrants into the United States military. And I'll just mention one of them, a typical example. Valdeta Mahanja was a refugee from Kosovo whose family fled to Germany, and they were given refuge in Germany, and she became fluent in German. Eventually came to the United States to study aviation at Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University, where she became a helicopter pilot and became an instructor pilot. And she also was the chair of the women's cross-country race team that ran a race across the United States for Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University. And I think they won the race. She was able to join the United States military under the MAVNI program. And she mentioned when she was joining that one of the reasons she wanted to join the military was because she remembered US troops rescuing her fellow refugees in Kosovo, and she wanted to be just like those troops who had rescued her. So she ended up joining the United States military, didn't have a green card, earned her citizenship through military service, and today she's a Black Hawk helicopter pilot with the Alabama National Guard and an officer. There are thousands upon thousands of immigrants like that out there who would love to join our nation's military, but right now our policies prevent them from doing that. And it's really unfortunate and harmful to our national security. You can imagine how much it helps to have a Black Hawk helicopter pilot who speaks German, Albanian, and English fluently and has a degree from Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University. That's a really wonderful thing for our nation's military, and it enhances our national security to have many more people like that.
Now that we've heard from each of our guests, let's dive into the importance of business creation for a robust economy, the challenges small businesses have faced, and the growth in new businesses created.
Dane, let me come back around to you. You mentioned how immigrants are more inclined to entrepreneurship than native-born Americans, and that those companies that they found tend to be some of the ones that have a very big impact on the economy, whether it's employing Americans or in terms of innovation. But I also know that you have noted, and others, both before you came to BPC and since, that rates of entrepreneurship in the United States had been kind of declining. What impact does it have when we're not creating businesses?
It's a good question, Teresa. So it's an accepted truth among those of us who work on small business and entrepreneurship that entrepreneurship is important for the U.S. economy. It's always worth reminding ourselves for why that is. New businesses tend to create more breakthrough innovations. New businesses are an important idea pipeline for larger companies, as I hope Kai will agree. New businesses are also an important source of net job creation. In any given year, the lion's share of net new job creation, so the balance of job creation, comes from those young companies, especially those young companies that grow. So that's the economic contribution of entrepreneurship. Pre-COVID, we were in a 15, even 20-year long-term decline in rates of new business creation, including rates of high growth entrepreneurship. So we were getting less employment bang from our high growth buck when it came to entrepreneurship. COVID hits spring into early summer of 2020, the early days of the pandemic, and rates of business creation, not surprisingly, fell off a cliff. Thousands, millions of small businesses closed permanently. There was huge demographic unevenness in that impact. And then there was a little bit of a recovery as some of those small businesses reopened, and they maybe reopened in a different form. And then what happened starting in about July of 2020 is rates of new business creation went absolutely through the roof, and they've continued at that historically high level up to today. We're creating, in terms of business applications that are being filed with the IRS, we're at almost twice as high as the numbers pre-COVID. And it's gone up and down a little bit. And every month people think, oh, now we're going to see the turn. It's going to revert to pre-COVID, but then it'll go up the next month. I just looked at the data yesterday. Through the first quarter of this year, we've actually created about, I think, 78% more businesses than were created during the first quarter of 2019. So we're still historically high rates of new business creation. Not all those new businesses are going to be employers. Not all of those businesses are going to be growth companies. Not all of those businesses are going to be, attractive acquisition targets for large businesses. But we're also seeing higher rates of those, what the statisticians call high propensity businesses that do employ people, are likely to grow, are likely to become bigger. It's still unclear, Teresa, how the breakdown is in terms of immigrant contribution to that boom, native-born contribution to that boom, and different demographic groups. What is clear is that we have a rapidly diversifying population of entrepreneurs and business owners. If we look at the numbers of businesses that are the number of young businesses, for example, that are owned by women, that are run by people of color, and run by immigrants, they tend to own younger businesses, which means they're starting them at a higher rate. There's still a breakdown in what happens to those businesses, but I think it's clear, Teresa, that immigrants are part of the story of driving this resurgence. What remains an open question and an intense topic of debate among people who enjoy parsing the entrepreneurship data is this a new normal of high business creation, or will we inevitably revert back to those long-term trends that we saw pre-COVID? That remains an open question.
Next, we're going to hear about the per-country caps that are causing long wait times and making it difficult to recruit talented people to the United States. Now back to the experts.
What can we learn from how other countries are engaging in the war for talent? We talked about Canada a lot. Canada, I think most of us would consider an ally, but clearly they're competing with us for workforce. And maybe we're not quite as concerned about people going to Canada as would go back to China or some other places. Kai, you represent an international company. Devyansh, you probably have studied as well. And maybe Margaret, even what are some things that other countries are doing that we maybe could think about doing, or what are they doing better?
Teresa, I'm happy to hop in here. You're right. We do have employees or just workers who want to go to Canada because it's so much easier. One of the things that we hear often is just transparency. There is processes in Canada and other places in which an applicant applies and is given a timeline, and that timeline is met. And throughout the process, they feel like they're being kept aware of where their application is in the process. That is something that we don't see in most of the applications that we work with our employees. They often come to us with questions about where they think their application is. They may get a message from, an automated message saying they need a request for more information or more evidence, an RFE, or just no answer at all. And that creates frustration. It creates stress on an individual level. And so, something that I would say is, I think our system, and maybe it's not built this way, but it just should be more transparent. Like, give them timelines that they really can focus on.
Divyansh, did you want to speak to that?
Yeah. So I was at the annual meeting of the American Association for the Advancement of Science this year, and Canada had a booth there. Canada and Germany both had their booths and were actively telling people, move to Canada, like handing out pamphlets with explicit directions on how to apply for their relevant visa pathways. The UK established a new uncapped visa program that they call the Global Talent Visa, which I think is very interesting because one of the key factors that, you could just have a UK RI grant, which is their equivalent of the National Science Foundation. If you have that grant, you qualify to apply for an uncapped green card that would provide you a pathway to residence in 2 to 5 years, you and your family. So one of the things that I can get my head around is, if we have identified that you are an exceptional ability individual, why are we putting a cap on that? I'm sure Margaret has a lot more to say on this.
Margaret, do you want to come in here?
Sure. We claim to be a free market capitalist economy, but when it comes to people, we're not. We're like the worst socialist bureaucracy ever. And for some reason, we just hate giving people green cards. I don't know why giving somebody a green card is such an awful thing, but we love to give people these visas that force them to be best friends with an immigration lawyer for 20 years, or, meet all kinds of requirements that only a person with a skilled attorney can possibly meet. But we just don't want to give people a green card. And the Canadians have figured out the magic, which is, they call it express entry. If you're smart and you speak English or French and you've got a college education, we're going to give you a green card really fast. And they also have an age limit on it too, because I think what they're doing is trying to figure out what their future workforce is going to look like. So they try to bring in younger people. So it's harder to qualify for a Canadian green card if you're older. But they figured out the magic. And when a young person from India looks at Canada is going to give me a green card in 6 months, and the United States is going to take 20 years to give me a green card, the choice is pretty simple. These are smart people, and they're not making dumb choices. So what we need to do is make it easy for people to get a green card. There's nothing that hurts America about lots of people getting green cards. It's just not a threat to our national security. In fact, it helps. They can then join the military if they want. But giving out lots of green cards isn't some dangerous thing for the United States. It's actually worse long-term to have people here, as millions of them are, in something less than a green card status. And today, that's the big problem. The 14% of the population is foreign born, but most of them don't have green cards. They have temporary protected status or parole or deferred action for childhood arrivals, or they're an asylum applicant, or, they have something else, one of the 80 plus different non-immigrant visas that they're trying to hang on to for years and years and years. And it's just silly and ridiculous and makes no sense. So we should do what the Canadians have done and make it easy for people to get a green card. If they're smart, they're talented, they graduate from one of our schools and they speak English, give them a green card.
It can really be astonishing to imagine the hoops that some have to jump through to try to gain a green card. We've got one more clip before we go, so let's end things on a positive note on what makes America so attractive to hundreds of thousands of migrants each year.
Margaret, I'm going to turn back to you because we have a couple of questions about the Canadian points-based system. Everyone seems to be aware that Canada has a points-based system. And is that something you think that we could adopt here, or how difficult it would be? And this gets a little to the politics of immigration. I think I'd ask some others to talk about the challenges of getting legislative change. But, just this concept of having a system that's based on point levels, and if you have one of these skills, if we can't do that here, are there things that we could do that would get us like some equivalent outcomes, if you will? You mentioned the shortage occupation list, for example.
Right. So it's kind of a misnomer. We already have a points-based system. We just don't call it that. Instead, we have a list of, 10 criteria and you have to meet 3 of them, or, we have 7 criteria and you have to meet 5 of the, we have a whole bunch of rules, basically. We don't call them points, and we don't give people a green card just because they get a certain number of points, but we do give green cards based on merit as defined in the Immigration and Nationality Act. Unfortunately, our criteria are really hard to meet and are really high. And so that's why it's very hard for people to get into these categories. And we don't just give a green card to somebody who simply has a bachelor's degree and speaks English and graduated from a U.S. university and expresses a desire to live here permanently. In fact, if somebody does that, we usually kick them out. So, I think it would be better if we had a more logical system that met our needs. You and I have talked separately about, there's a bureaucratic schedule called Schedule A, where the Department of Labor can simply designate something as a shortage occupation, and that allows a person to apply for a green card if they meet the requirements for that occupation. I think it would enhance our national security dramatically if we'd change the list of occupations. Right now, there's only 2 occupations on that list: registered nurse and physical therapist. That's it. So we have dire shortages in a whole bunch of other areas, and they're just not on the list. And the Department of Labor hasn't updated the list in decades and has no plans to update the list in decades. Yeah. With regard to what somebody mentioned earlier, we need to have a little more faith in what makes us strong as a nation. And the biggest attraction we have as a country is actually our political promise that if you come here, you can be successful. You're not going to have a totalitarian government leaning down on your shoulder every minute and telling you what to do and putting your family in prison. Most of the Chinese I've talked to who came to America don't want to live in China. They just rather live in the United States, and they would readily integrate into American society and help us in a strategic struggle against China, whom they don't view favorably. They don't view their own country favorably at the moment, and they'd be willing to help us if we'd let them. So we don't want to just adopt some blind eye and just say everybody from China is dangerous. And what someone mentioned earlier is correct. We have a huge national security apparatus. Guess what? We catch spies every day of the week. It's not rocket science. We've been catching spies since 1775. I think Benedict Arnold, was one. And it's not something we don't know how to do. It's not something that should cause us to turn a whole nation off and decide we're just not going to let anybody from that country into our country. That's exactly the wrong approach to take.
Another great quote from Margaret: "We need to have more faith in what makes us strong as a nation, the political promise that you can come here and be successful." Thank you so much to all of our listeners for joining us for a recap of our event. We hope you've enjoyed it and learned something new. If you want to check out the whole event, you can find it on BPC's website by selecting all past events under our resources tab. And that's it for our show this week. One last reminder to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform, and share it with your friends and colleagues. You can also find more information on all of the issues we discuss here on the show at bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration. You can follow the Bipartisan Policy Center on Twitter at BPC_bipartisan. You can follow Teresa Cardinal Brown at BPC_T Brown. For feedback or questions, you can contact us by emailing immigration@bipartisanpolicy.org. I'm Hanadi Jordan. This Week in Immigration was created and executive produced by Teresa Cardinal Brown. This week's episode was written by Hanadi Jordan, Natalie Butler, and Teresa Cardinal Brown. Our audio editor is Joshua Joe. The executive producer of BPC Podcasts is Lucy Manning. See you next time on This Week in Immigration.